Shalom Shalom and welcome. The Bible cover to cover, and I am your host Donnie Wallner. In this episode I want to do another character study of an unlikely character, one of the 12 disciples. Like in a previous episode, we examined Peter walking on the water, where I argue that too often we are too critical towards Peter, and maybe our criticism should be more towards the 11 disciples who never stepped foot out of the boat. When Jesus said, "Come," in response to Peter asking him if he can come to him, I believe Jesus' simple response to come is an open invitation not merely to Peter, but to all the other disciples. But the other disciples did not move, they did not step one foot out of the boat. Rather, they sat there in fear and trembling. So in this episode we will also look at one of the disciples that often draws a lot of criticism, and his name is Thomas, which we often call Doubting Thomas. Thomas amazes me. Despite him being criticized and even called Doubting Thomas, I want to speak in his defense and explain why I believe he deserves greater recognition. And also by examining his interactions he had, whether it's with the disciples or with Jesus, how we too can learn as followers of Jesus to maybe have a character that is more like Thomas' character. And we will examine 3 areas in the Gospels where Thomas is highlighted. So the first one is in John 11:16. The verse says, "Therefore Thomas, who is called Didymus, said to his fellow disciples, 'Let us also go, so that we may die with him.'" Before that, Jesus fled north because in Judiah, or near Jerusalem, and in Jerusalem, there was an increasing danger or animosity towards Jesus, and the leaders trying to seek ways to destroy Jesus and his ministry, because Jesus was becoming more and more bold, speaking up against the corrupt temple system and the corruption of the leaders. So he went northward, but then he received news that his best friend Lazarus was very sick. Lazarus and his 2 sisters, Mary and Martha, they lived in Bethany, which was only 2 or 3 miles from Jerusalem. So the vast majority of Jesus' ministry was in Galilee, which was to the north. Between Galilee and the region of Judiah was Samaria. So immediately his disciples responded to him and says, "You can't go back there. It is way too dangerous." And a lot of times we often forget that Jesus is not only God incarnate, but is also fully human, meaning he shares in our weaknesses. He too was tempted. He too was tested. He suffered alongside us, and therefore he was able to sympathize with us. So in one respect, in Jesus' humanity, Jesus being tempted would have also struggled with the idea of, okay, if I return to the region of Judea, I am putting myself at great risk of being arrested or persecuted, and ultimately I would face death. And we can see that in the Garden of Gethsemane, where he struggled with that. It was not just the fact that he was going to be crucified, there was more on his shoulders, so to speak, the sins of the world. But still, I think in the perspective of his humanity, we need to understand that it wasn't as easy as we might assume for Jesus to put himself in harm's way. And so here we have Thomas speaking up, encouraging him, saying, "Master, teacher, Lord, whatever it is you decide to do, let us follow you." So he's speaking to the disciples, trying to convince them, let us follow wherever Jesus is going to go. And Thomas, being the more pessimistic person, as it seems, said, so that we may die with him. Thomas' response tells us three things about him. First, let us also go, expresses his loyalty to Jesus. And the later part, when he said, so that we may die with him, expresses his willingness to lay down his life for his Lord, while at the same time expressing his pessimistic view of going to Judiah. Now, this pessimistic view is realistic. It is. Again, because of the clear danger of stepping foot into the region of Judiah. So like in a previous episode when we discussed Peter and only him stepping out of the water and the 11 remaining in the boat, there's something similar going on here where the disciples, the other 11 disciples, were trying to convince Jesus to not go into Judea. Thomas is willing to follow his master, which should challenge us. Is our following Jesus conditional? And when things become hard and challenging and maybe could put us into a situation where that is dangerous, do we want to draw a line there, or are we willing, like Thomas, to say, Jesus, I will remain loyal to you no matter the cost? So the second text I want to cover is Thomas questioning Jesus. In John 14:5-6, Thomas said to him, Lord, we do not know where you are going. How do we know the way? Jesus said to him, I am the way, and the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but through me. Because of Thomas not being afraid to approach Jesus and asking him questions in times when Jesus, the way he spoke to them, was so confusing. Like they didn't wrap their heads around a lot of times what Jesus was saying. I view Thomas's questioning and pressing Jesus for an answer as a character of humility. As a mentor once told me, that no question is a stupid question. Don't ever be afraid to ask, even if it feels like you should know the answer to that question. And it does require putting aside our pride, because often a lot of times in our own insecurities, we are afraid to ask questions because we are afraid that it will humiliate us, or people will roll their eyes at us. But no, for Thomas, he wasn't afraid to press any kinds of questions upon Jesus. And because of that, Jesus' response is one of the most, if not the most, radical and profound statements in the Bible. And all because Thomas wasn't afraid to ask the question. I truly appreciate Thomas, a straightforward character, not afraid to ask and engage his Messiah. Him asking questions is a good argument about his willingness to believe in the words of his teacher. And I think it goes to, say, in our own communities, in our own church, do we have too much pride to go to another brother or sister, or maybe even a young person, and discuss and ask questions? So the third time Thomas shows up in the gospel is his interaction between Yeshua after Yeshua had been resurrected. And it's John 20, verses 24-29. Let us read them. But Thomas, one of the 12, called Didymus, was not with them when Jesus came. So again, that is after his resurrection. So the other disciples were saying to him, We have seen the Lord. But he said to them, Unless I see in his hands the imprint of his nails, and put my finger into the place of the nails, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe. After 8 days, his disciples were again inside, and Thomas was with them. Jesus came, the doors having been shut, and stood in their midst and said, Peace be with you. Then he said to Thomas, "Reach here with your finger and see my hands, and reach here your hand and put it into my side, and do not be unbelieving, but believing." Thomas answered and said to him, "My Lord and my God." Jesus said to him, "Because you have seen me, have you believed? Blessed are you who did not see and yet believed." Why this gospel was written. People tend to be very critical towards Thomas, but I would argue that Thomas was expressing how all the other disciples were feeling before their encounter with the resurrected Christ. So what happened to them after Jesus was crucified? He died on the cross, and they put him in a tomb. They all went to their own home. They also thought, it's over, it's done with. I believe Thomas was the most honest out of all of them. Thomas was a very transparent person. As the saying goes, what's inside is outside, and that seems to be the case with Thomas. What was on his heart, he spoke openly about it. He wasn't ashamed, and I think that speaks to his humility. He was not ashamed to admit his unbelief. It's an unbelief that all the other disciples were struggling with. But of course, Steve, at that point when Thomas met Jesus, the other disciples have already met him. So the other disciples were believing at that point. I also believe Thomas was the first to wholeheartedly believe Christ to be God because of his public confession. "My Lord and my God," he said. For that reason, I would argue Thomas's faith was far greater than the rest of the disciples. He was bold enough to question and courageous enough to confess Christ as his Lord and God. So that first encounter in the Gospels that we covered in John 11, he professed his loyalty and his willingness to follow Jesus even to the point of death. He wasn't afraid to confront Jesus and question him. And through that questioning, he received profound insights which we today have been so richly blessed because of Thomas. And because of Thomas, who wasn't afraid to openly admit his unbelief. We also have this in the Gospels where Thomas proclaimed publicly and said, "My Lord and my God." He recognized Jesus as God. It was because of Thomas' engagement and questioning that we have greater insight into Jesus. The more I consider the character of Thomas, the more I recognize his humility and willingness to learn, knowing his own insufficiency, yet willing to trust his master with all his heart, even at the risk of losing his own life. Being more like Thomas means we are willing to seek the truth instead of letting our doubts silence us. See, I think here's the fundamental difference between Thomas and even the other disciples, that the others were silent in their doubting. But Thomas asked and was openly professing the fact that he was struggling with his faith. Unlike the other disciples, Thomas found the courage to ask, and because he asked, he received the truth. In Matthew 7:7-8, Jesus says this, "Ask, and it will be given to you. Seek, and you will find. Knock, and it will be opened to you. For everyone who asks receives, and he who seeks finds, and to him who knocks it will be opened." And this is what I see in the character of Thomas, that in spite of his doubting, in spite of his unbelief, which is only reflective of what every other disciple was experiencing. And so if you are experiencing any kind of doubt, Maybe you're confused about something, whether it's in the Gospels or anywhere in the Bible. Seek God on your knees. Pray and ask Him. Read and study your scriptures. Ask faithful followers, those who have been traveling on this journey. Chances are they can relate to you. They have been through what you are going through. Don't be ashamed to open up and admit and say, Lord, help my unbelief. He is a gracious God, a loving God. He's not a God that demands from His children that we have all the answers. He came down to this earth in the form of a human being, in the likeness of man. He went through all the struggles, all the temptations that we are going through. He's a God who sympathizes with us. And He wants us to ask. He wants us to open ourselves up to Him, to receive Him with a heart that is full of humility and contrite in spirit. It's not about how much we know, but more importantly, to be faithful and true to the things that we know are true. And He is a God who wants us to seek Him. There's a verse in Proverbs 25, verse 2, that has been one of the driving forces that has challenged me to continually seek God. It says that it is the glory of God to conceal a matter, but the glory of kings is to search out a matter. But a proud heart never seeks God. Proud heart is good enough. But the humble and contrite in spirit, those are the ones who open themselves up, open up their minds and their hearts to receive Him and to seek Him in His Word, in prayer. And because of that, those are the ones who the Word looks upon as foolish, whom God reveals Himself to. To God be the glory. I hope this has been a blessing, and I wish the peace of Christ upon you all. May you have a wonderful day. Shalom and goodbye.